Hello and welcome to The Researchers Among Us, busting myths about games, gamers, and games research. We have a fabulous panel here today of researchers from the University of Melbourne Human-Computer Interaction Lab, here to talk about their work in the wider world of games research in general. I'm Dr. Fraser Allison, and I'll be your moderator, and then we have our wonderful panelists who will introduce themselves in a moment. But before we get to that, I'd like to do a quick acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land from which we're speaking. So we'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land from which we're speaking. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be watching. And so what I thought we'd do to kick off is do a quick round of introductions by saying our names, briefly what we research, what we focus on, and what one of our favorite games right now is. So as I said, I'm Dr. Fraser Allison, and I have studied voice-controlled games and various other weird and wonderful user experiences in online games in particular. And one of my favorite games at the moment is the Total War series, the Warhammer games in particular, because games can be art, but what I like is artillery. So I guess I'll throw to Lucy to go next.
All right, so yep, I'm Lucy. I'm a PhD researcher studying ethics and multiplayer gameplay and design. I'd say my absolute favorite game in recent times has to be Disco Elysium, which I think Fraser, actually, you told me to get into. So yes, I just adore it. It's an amazing game.
Jane.
Yeah, hi, I am almost Dr. Jane Malvoa. I've submitted my PhD and it's all ready to go. I'm just waiting for it to graduate so I can officially call myself doctor. My research is about children's digital play. So I've looked in great detail at 6 to 8 year olds and how they play in Minecraft. My favorite game at the moment, I think the one that comes to mind is a game called Spiritfarer, which I've played on the Xbox, which I think Lucy recommended to me, which is a delightful kind of delightful game about death. But it's lovely. Yeah, and we've also been playing a lot of Zoom board games as well with the kids and other people.
Geoffrey, could you go next?
Hello, my name's Geoffrey Hill. I'm studying private MMO servers, so like the pirate MMO servers that people play instead of the official ones. And kind of my favorite games right now, I'm going to cheat and answer with 2. One's related to the research, which is there's a hardcore World of Warcraft flavor or server where you get 1 life, and if you die, it's all over. So, you know, you're looking at a week or more worth of actual game time could be gone in that 1 bad pull. But the game that I'm playing and enjoying quite a lot is Umurangi Generation, which just recently won the IGF Grand Prize. It's an Australian Maori game, and it's doing some amazing things around politics and its subversion of that in the games medium. So yeah, they're my 2.
Great, thanks, Geoffrey. Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian McKittrick. I'm a PhD student here at Uni Melbourne. My research is into the origins and development of Let's Play communities, looking at how they started on the Something Awful forums. If I had to pick my favorite game right now, I might cheat and I'll cheat like Geoffrey did and say 2. For when I want to feel like actually powerful, I play RimWorld and order people around in my colony. And for when I want to escape the capitalist hellscape that we live in, I play Hard Space Shipbreaker, so I can escape into a different capitalist hellscape.
Very nice. And Madeline, could you round us off, please?
Absolutely. So I'm Madeline Antonellis. I'm a PhD candidate in my final year at Melbourne Uni as well. And I'm studying the professionalisation and digitisation of the cosplay community in Australia. My favourite game in recent memory has to go to Nier Automata. It was a truly philosophically enriching experience, as well as just, an incredible sort of realization of the medium at that time. So
fantastic. Great set of games here. We could start a kind of a curated list. So I thought, first of all, we should kind of set the groundwork for this conversation by talking about what games research even is. And if I think about, before I became a games researcher, what would I have had in mind if someone said they did games research? And it'd be something like people sitting in a kind of a lab room, probably with a two-way mirror there, and they're hooked up to electrodes, and they're playing Among Us, and we're scanning their brainwaves to see what happens when they get stabbed in the back, or something along those lines. Very, very scientific. Brian, is that roughly what you do every day?
Well, if you asked me like 5 or 8 years ago when I was still figuring out my degree plan, I would have thought games research meant like those weird economics games that econ majors like recruit students in college to do, where you get $20 at the end if you do well. But no, that's not really what I do in particular. Games research for me is more about looking at like online spaces and how people report their own experiences in games, either like just in like general discussion forums or chat channels on Discord, or in some cases like direct interviews with them. But not really like in a sterile environment, because context is kind of important to capture in these things.
Yeah, I think in a sense, everyone here in one way or another is studying kind of communities and people as much as games themselves and sort of design as an object, which really makes the challenge of games research of that kind about kind of how do you approach understanding a community. There's almost as much anthropology related to it as something kind of more technically oriented. And I suppose that kind of brings up challenges and sensitivities. Geoffrey, you talk about studying these private communities. How do you go about that? What are the challenges of approaching that as a topic?
Yeah, so similar to Brian, I'm looking at some of the communication. I'm looking at what's happening in the space on the internet that these communities are a part of. One of the big challenges that I'm encountering right at the start of my research here is the changing places that communications are happening online. If you go back, say, 10 years, conversations, discussions, problem solving, all that stuff in these communities of private MMO server developers, their administrators, the people who are involved in this community, the players as well, that was all happening online on forums. And forums were really great things in that they're easy to find, they're pretty easy to search, and they're quite easy to archive. What we're finding, or certainly what I'm finding at the moment, is that a lot of this important history is moving away from that type of platform. And they're moving on to a lot of like private networks, so social media particularly. So we're seeing a lot of communication happen on Discord. We're seeing it happen on Twitter. We're seeing it happen on Reddit. And one of the challenges around that is that these are private networks, and they are separated from kind of the wider public internet, and they have different sets of rules and different sets of ways to engage with them. We're not able to easily crawl them to find the information we're necessarily looking for. So that's been one of the big difficulties that I've started to encounter in trying to research, particularly the last kind of 5 years of activity around this space, that the conversations and the information is being hidden in these private networks now, and that kind of worries me a lot about the space that I'm looking at, particularly where it's really separated from our internet, our public internet, to this private space.
So what are people doing about that challenge of kind of accessing these private spaces and these things that may have kind of previously been kind of open and accessible?
Yeah, well, certainly as social media is starting to become a prominent place where these conversations are engaging, and these companies are kind of owning and controlling access to these spaces. They are becoming and starting to be conscious of their separation from the public internet, and they're starting to consider, okay, well, what are my the things that I should, as a network, be doing, or a social media network be doing to ensure that research can happen in these spaces. So each of the larger companies, like the Twitters and the Reddits, they are starting to build or have built policies and systems that might allow researchers to engage with it. But it is very narrow and very narrowly scoped in a way in which is to benefit them as much as it is to benefit the researchers. So it's still a really evolving conversation that we really need to be conscious of, and we're starting to see even governments starting to be engaged with this, particularly around the ethical issues of conversations and communication in media. Governments are starting to engage with the social media networks and say, okay, well, how are you ensuring that people who need to look into your inside the systems and see the conversations that are happening and see the activities that are happening, how are you providing them with access so that they can validate the things that you are saying, or that you're not hiding things that necessarily shouldn't be going on, or we don't want to be going on. So it's definitely an evolving conversation, unfortunately, and at the moment, as a researcher, I'm just kind of scraping together tools that are gonna scrape the parts that I need, and may or may not necessarily break any user license agreements when I go searching for a particular tag, and I have to run it over a script overnight to go through all the tags on Twitter, for example. So it's still an evolving space, but it's something that they're starting to be conscious of as we get these private networks doing the role of what we had of the public internet previously.
I think it's some great points there, Jeff. And I just wanted to add too that we in the cosplay community, we kind of see a lot of private groups on Facebook emerge as, I guess, central points of information dissemination and obviously communication between people in the community. And perhaps in some ways, I guess, to break past that view of the researchers with their, brain scanners and sitting with their white coats. For me, it's, and there's a big kind of 1980s sci-fi imaginary I always think of the white-coated PhD student that gets to do whatever they want in this exciting world. And of course, there's an element of research that does, prompt you to take risks and to obviously step outside your comfort zone. But for me, when I'm researching with cosplayers, and even when I've been in cosplay researching cosplayers, for me, it's akin to, even if you're on social media, and I'm sure you feel the same, Jeff, but it's akin to almost standing next to someone and perhaps eavesdropping, as opposed to asking whether you might be a part of the conversation. And whenever I guess, get invited to a private community, I do feel, I guess, a sense of a little bit, grateful and honored to be privy to these parts of the community that do feel very private and obviously very important, but that harbor some very, very, sensitive and critical debates as well. So for me, it's very much negotiating with the administrator of the particular group as well. For me, it's sort of a no-touch zone in terms of private rooms and discords, unless we do get that express permission to perhaps, take some research from that space. I mean, as a kind of general rule, I think a lot of us, in terms of our ethics and stuff, we do pay attention to that notion of what really should be kept private, and just as general human beings try to always adhere to that, like what we wouldn't want necessarily to, express ourselves to the public. We do use common sense, but at the end of the day, it does come down to a lot of, just that kind of permission as well to research. And we are really happy to work with participants to kind of make sure that we don't breach that level of trust that we really want to build with you, because it's not about, I guess, as you're saying, sitting there and peeking in on you with our binoculars. We very much want to kind of get involved in the situation and see what you're building, which is so much more interesting to us than kind of making assumptions from afar. So yeah, I just wanted to add that as well, because great points there, Jeff.
Yeah, that really mirrors some of the conversations I've been having with my supervisor recently about two kind of sets of information gathering that I'm looking to do in this space.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One that is a public facing, but then there's also that. Well, what about when I join these communities and I'm playing on the servers? I mentioned earlier the hardcore one that I'm playing around on, where the One Life. There's a really distinct community there, and the conversations are really different. And there's questions that I need to be very conscious of around the ethical implications, exactly as you say, of being a part of that conversation, or even just being around it, where there is a presumption of privacy. Yeah.
Totally.
I could speak to this as well. I mean, my research hasn't been so much on communities, but I've in my PhD, I went into family households and did sort of an ethnographic study. So just thinking about privacy and ethics again. So I was very much explicitly there to find out what was going on and what sort of like routines and discussions that parents had with children about their gameplay and everything. And I think researching with children, there's a whole nother layer of ethical considerations there, because, you know, there's issues around consent. And so I think we just have to be really careful about how we navigate those things. And I certainly was really conscious. It was sort of like an odd position. I've never actually thought of this before, Maddie, but a connection with your research. This, you know, like children would show me around their bedrooms and like, look at this Lego thing I built and look at this, you know, because I got them to do play tours. So I wanted to know everything about their play worlds, including their digital play. So it really felt, I mean, and they were so happy, so enthusiastic. They're like, oh, someone's here to talk to me for 2 hours about Minecraft. What could be better? But I did feel, it was kind of, there's this fine line between wanting to get really good data and also respecting, of course, the privacy and the different power relationships. And I mean, you can't get away from the fact that we're researchers and we're there for a purpose. But yeah, it's just a case of communicating that with families and participants or community members. So yeah, complicated, but we need to do it.
I would also say, like, as another facet of this whole, our relationship with our communities that we're looking at is like, for me, and I can't speak for everyone, but for me, like, part of the reason why I got into researching was because I was already kind of part of the community I wanted to research about, and I wanted to represent them as best as possible. And there's always been like this sort of nagging thought in the back of my head, like, what if they hate what I write? What if they dislike what I've written? And I'm always striving to like do my best by my participants in the community.
Yeah, something that I find really important as well for me in researching ethics and people's ethical views about what's acceptable and what isn't in a game. I think sometimes players can be very, very alert and sensitive to the potential to being judged for what they do, because that does happen a lot in the media. So when I'm speaking to players, I try to make it really, really clear that, you know, when I'm asking you, is this okay to do in a game, for instance, I'm not there to argue with them or judge them or criticize them for what they're doing. I'm honestly there to hear their perspectives and see where they're coming from. And I think that that's so important to convey as well.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that's where, coming back to this idea of maybe like a stereotypical view of games research being sort of in that media effects school of thought, where it is kind of, what does this particular bit of media or this amount of X amount of gameplay do to people, and what's the outcome and how can you measure it? And I think that's sort of stuff that makes it into the media coverage of game studies, and that maybe makes players feel a little bit skeptical or a little bit hesitant to engage with research. And I know, like, I've done other research with slightly older children about their Fortnite play and their opinions on the media coverage of concepts around addiction and stuff. And they're quite savvy and quite conscious of the way that their hobbies are talked about in the media. So I think, we just to let people be aware that we're not all trying to work out, you know, whether what you're doing is good or bad. Likewise with my stuff, it's not about, are you parenting according to whatever good parenting means, or, you know, we genuinely want to understand what's going on as a way to kind of just scope the reality of gaming communities and gaming practices, as well as also inform better research questions later on. So yes, so it's important to, and I had to say that in mine as well, like, and I think I even put that on the participant information sheet. I'm not here to judge your parenting style. I don't, you know, I'm not, you can tell me if your child spends this many hours playing whatever, it's okay. That's not the purpose of my research.
How many parents asked you about, are you looking into how video games affect children in violent behaviors?
Oh yeah, like literally every person, when you say you're doing research on children and games, it's like, oh, so you're trying to work out how addictive they are. They're so addictive, and you're trying to work out what they do to children's brains and development. And I'm like, no, that's not me. Other people do that, but no, I'm understanding. I'm interested in what children are doing and what they're playing, and my lens is through video game play as a form of play, and we know that play is really important for children. They have a legal right to play. So I'm trying to I'm just coming at it from a different perspective. And it's not that one is better or worse. It's just definitely the conception is that if you're researching anything to do with children in games, it's got to be about development or education or health. And to some degree, it kind of is. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there is that dominant thread in the existing research, but it is starting to change. Like, we're getting much more kind of nuanced perspectives coming out about play that happens to involve a digital device or a screen.
Yeah, I think sometimes similarly to you, Jane, when people hear that I'm studying ethics in games, they think I'm looking at the effects that things like violent video games are going to have on players. And there can be some kind of caution around that, some eye rolls and stuff. And the thing is, ethics in this context is about so much more than violent video games. And it's about so much more than the effects that playing can have on us. It's about, the rules and the norms that form in online communities, how people decide and negotiate what's acceptable to do in communities. And I think it's fascinating because it's also about how these digital and playful worlds bring about new and interesting ethical issues that are kind of similar to ones that we already face in the physical world, but they're also slightly different in a way that we haven't ever faced before, as a species. And I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a really good point that there's kind of a long shadow that sometimes hangs over, especially the perception of games research from this sort of two branches of it in a way. There's the research that's come from concerns from the outside, and then there's a large community of people who are studying games because they're interested in them, and they're kind of somewhat in tension. Now, while we're not we're not here to judge, it is a topic of interest and concern for a lot of people, and something that you'll kind of hear a lot about is this idea of kind of toxic behavior or sort of negative behaviors in games, in game communities. Partly that's that idea of do games encourage this, and partly I think there's a wider sense that people have, including a lot of kind of game players, that toxic behavior, griefing, trolling, negative behaviors in general are this sort of inevitability. It's this force of nature. And I think that's something that kind of touches on everyone's research area in one way or another. Lucy, I know you've looked at this question in particular. So can you tell us kind of what you've found from your research about the question of kind of toxicity, or whatever term you'd use in games?
Yeah, so that notion that toxic behavior is inevitable is a really interesting one, because it's something that comes up a lot from both when I've spoken to players and when I've spoken to people working in the games industry. And it's interesting because, of course, to some extent, there are always going to be bad actors in any community, right? People who actively want to harm. But very often it just naturally stems from the structures that we operate in and misunderstandings and disagreements over what we value. And that's exactly the same in something like a multiplayer game. So something like toxicity arises sometimes from the structure of the game itself. So in a competitive game like Overwatch or League of Legends, working as a team, especially with strangers, can present some unique challenges. Let's say players can get really tilted from their losses. They start to blame their teammates, and it can kind of spiral from there. And even the most reasonable or cool-headed person can get sucked into this sometimes, right? Like I have been sucked into it when playing Overwatch, right? So, while it's true that I don't think games are necessarily ever going to be this magical utopia where everybody is somehow magically nice to each other, and I don't even think that that's what a lot of players want, right? Like we like to have disagreements sometimes. We like to get into these. It helps us grow and figure out what we value. But, there are ways to address these issues that aren't serving us. Something like tilt and toxicity contagion can be addressed through adjustments in game design and setting good examples of more positive behavior. And importantly, engaging in an open discussion, both in the industry and with players, about what we actually are valuing about playing and what we really do think about what's acceptable and what isn't. And that's an ongoing process. And I think, yeah, everybody has a part to play in that.
One of the things I've been seeing in my recent research around the places that people are playing in private servers are some really active player conversations about the tone of particular servers and the amount of toxicity versus friendliness that is coming up. And there's certainly in the WoW server community, there's a real shift towards, oh, these are the preferred servers because the community is positive and friendly and encouraging, and these are the servers to avoid because they're very min-max, not friendly, might be toxic, might be doing things that are really perceived as negative. So I think the players themselves as well are becoming very attuned to this and actually making selective decisions about the places and types of games they want to participate in more broadly.
Yeah.
Interesting too, because they I guess in the cosplay community where you've got this activity that obviously stems from engaging in something like gameplay in a lot of cases where you're trying to represent that love on your actual person, right? I found, I guess, in my research as well that the kind of I guess the toxicity and the kind of especially perhaps the stigmas that do relate to that do kind of get brought up in society in relation to a lot of our various communities that we study, there is this interesting kind of dynamic where I guess especially in cosplay we do see the kind of toxicity perhaps that may start in some gaming spaces bleed through into the dialogue around the actual costuming of those characters on people and things like, the accuracy or appropriateness or the, I guess, the manner of representation. But interestingly enough, too, I just wanted to bring up that through my studies, what we find as well is that a lot of the perhaps negativity or toxicity in relation to cosplay also comes primarily from, as I guess you guys were touching on too, is just the notion of misunderstanding between human beings, which is something that obviously comes from living in a time where we are so digitally connected and physically connected and trying to navigate the different social situations that happen in these different spaces. But ultimately we find that cosplayers don't actually, I guess, attribute necessarily a lot of the toxicity to specifically, I guess, the community of gamers or cosplayers that engage directly in the activity. Unfortunately, especially in our kind of space with, adjacent careers that, to gaming, like streaming or cosplay or things like this, is that essentially it's coming a lot from people that don't understand what these communities are. It's attributed a lot to people in the general public that perhaps still to this point haven't quite come to terms with what all these different hobbies are and how they are articulated. And so there is this kind of, I guess, concerning dynamic for me where I guess even though we've come quite far in understanding a lot of elements of perhaps even specifically the nature of toxicity and like gaming as we're sort of seeing research now, it's interesting to see that we're still also getting this push from the outside where there's kind of people pointing their fingers going, what is this? What is this? And part of my research as well is just trying to reduce toxicity in terms of public commentary and interactions with people in our communities that we research by broadening understandings and simply saying, hey, it's okay to actually dress up as a character or, run through a story online via YouTube that, creates a narrative around a game. These things are quite beautiful creative processes. And I guess a big thing for us all, I'm sure, is trying to also defeat that toxicity that potentially stems from the outside where we have that old school, what are the nerds doing discussion, as opposed to just looking into the incredible, detailed and deep things that are emerging from our communities, right?
Yeah, there's so many fascinating things to jump on there. I want to put a pin in the idea of kind of spectatorship and streaming and kind of the larger perspective and come back to that in a moment. But I just thought, Jane, I should throw to you because I know some of your research has been about the role of sort of the way in which kind of activities that potentially destructive or aggressive or kind of could fit within that frame of toxicity and griefing and so forth appears in kids' play. And it's a somewhat kind of complex picture how you think about that. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I guess the main thing to note here is just that context really matters. And if we look at children's play historically, I mean, children have always played in some quite horrible ways. Like, I don't know, if we think back to some of the earlier games that were just, and rhymes and schoolyard antics that were just awful, you know, like there's a collection by a couple called the Opies, Iona and Peter Opie, who documented schoolyard play across England in the, I think, the 50s to 70s. And some of the stuff in there, honestly, you wouldn't be allowed to show it on television. It's that, I mean, it's not toxic, it's racist and sexist and the thing is, and we don't really lament the loss of those sorts of forms of play. Just want to say, like, no one's complaining that we don't tell racist jokes at schoolyards anymore or anything, but we do complain that they're playing online. Anyway, that's off topic. Yeah, just so, I mean, play can be transgressive and you can playfully kind of be antagonistic, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But I don't want this to sound like I'm in any way condoning anything that's not appropriate or that is clearly toxic, but just to note that part of play can be playing with those sort of moral boundaries, especially for children. In my research, I found a lot of kind of, I guess what you would call griefing between siblings that was highly antagonistic and not necessarily consensual, and that resulted in parents getting involved and, you know, brokering between parties and stuff like that. But that's kind of siblings, you know. And then there was other cases where children were playing on their own, and, you know, in one instance, a boy was having a great time just spawning and killing villagers for no other reason other than, I think it was kind of like a visceral kind of pleasure that he was able to spawn and then kill them. And then his mother walked in and it was like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, no, you know," and had to do this whole justification process. So it was almost like a kind of a working through what's acceptable and not through the process of play. So I think it's important that we consider that play can be nasty, and that's not always a bad thing, but without, yeah.
It does sound like, it does sound for kids, at least that in your research, part of play is finding out, like, what is possible within this space and what does it feel like to do these things. And it doesn't matter exactly like what they do, it's just they're learning the limits of this boundaries.
Yes. And I mean, and that's one of the functions of play, right? Historically, that children, at least, you know, in historical times where children's play wasn't so surveilled, like children would go off and play without an adult necessarily watching, whereas now there's a lot of concern about safety and stranger danger. And I mean, of course, right now here in Melbourne, we're like stuck inside. It's kind of hard to not know what they're doing. But so if we think of play as this sort of like a little space, a little microcosm of a world where children get to experiment and try things out and learn the consequences of those actions. If you do something nasty in a game of whatever, and then no one wants to play with you anymore, that's a natural consequence. So, yeah.
I would add as well that stems long into adulthood. I mean, people are all, especially when you're playing around in a virtual world and it's kind of a different space and you're not really sure what the community expects of you and you're not sure what's allowed in the game, like people will always be kind of poking holes and seeing what they can do. And it's a really important area in the ethics of games, especially. I think that there is this difficulty that arises in drawing a line between these kind of boundary or gray cases. There's some things that are clearly unacceptable in games, that are very harassing, that are abusive.
Yeah.
And not many people would argue with that, right? But then there are a lot of things that are kind of griefy, a little bit trolly, that maybe are humorous or fun, or to some people, or add something to the game in a way that some players value, that, you know, maybe you don't want to totally eradicate these sorts of behaviors altogether from a game. And that's something that the game designers I've spoken to as well grapple with constantly in multiplayer games, that, okay, you know, they're constantly having to make these difficult decisions about, okay, does this person need to be suspended actually? Do they need to be banned? Or like, how am I supposed to deal with this? And it's a whole issue of governance and making these snap decisions sometimes about what the community of a game should value. It's quite difficult.
I think I just want to add, so listening to you, Lucy, talking about those online gaming communities and then how I've described children's play, I guess one important point of difference is that like the power relations between groups of players. So perhaps maybe in online game spaces inhabited by older players, there's more of a potential for that classic kind of bullying where there's a power imbalance, and then that really matters. And I can imagine that must be really hard to judge. Whereas, so the examples that I was giving of child's play, perhaps we can assume that there's a more equal kind of power relationship between players, and therefore that kind of experimenting and boundary testing has a different set of consequences than when it's on a larger scale with, the potential for like power relations that are not equal.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about this sort of play is the way that it for both, you know, say a griefer and the person on the other end of it, or people, it's a way of heightening emotion and creating stories, even if it's not a story you chose to participate in. So I did some research with players of DayZ, which one of the distinctive things about that is it's a game like you were talking about, Geoffrey, with the private, I think it was a WoW server. You know, this is a game where you have persistent progress, but your character can die. And the striking kind of thing about the responses, the appeal that people talked about in a game like that is that the fact that bad things can happen in a way that has some, not a wider effect on your life, but at least a kind of, you know, it does affect what you have access to, what you can do, heightens the experience and creates this kind of sense of the spectacular. And so part of the appeal of that, there's the in the moment kind of excitement of not knowing that if you approach a person, how are they going to respond to you? Are they trustworthy? And all those sorts of questions. And then after the game, the stories that can come out of that can be quite interesting. You know, people would, viewers may have seen, you know, there were stories came out of DayZ about people getting kidnapped and forced to drink strange things and all this stuff. And although it's an unpleasant thing to go through in reality, as a story, it's sort of quite memorable and kind of potentially funny. But there was a big distinction in there between that kind of thing where something happens to you that's kind of negative or that you didn't choose, but is remarkable, that is kind of spectacular, that you can, you know, if you were recording it, it would make a good viewing experience, versus the person who just sits there and maybe kills people without them even knowing that they're there, in a way that, you know, in a place that's not designed for that. And that sense of, okay, well, that was meaningless. That was kind of, it was a negative thing. Maybe they got some kind of enjoyment out of it, but for me, it wasn't interesting. And I think I'd like to plug that back into our kind of conversation about this idea, which I think has only grown over time, over the years, that increasingly, to understand games today, you have to understand them partly as sort of individual experiences and partly as this spectator kind of communal wider picture. That is huge in the past, say, 5 years, but it does have a longer history. And Brian, I'd like to talk about, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your research on Let's Plays and the history of that, and kind of how that has developed over time through to the situation we have today.
Yeah, so Let's Plays historically started sometime around 2005 through 2007. There's no widely agreed upon date as to when the first Let's Play happened. And there are precursors like video walkthroughs or text walkthroughs for games that could be considered like prototypes or proto Let's Plays. A lot of overlap happens between Let's Plays and machinima in the early days, because around then was when the machinima boom was really taking off with Red versus Blue and similar things. But I would say, like, there's a definite through line of when Let's Play started and how they became like streaming and streaming spectator performances. Like in 2007, there was no Twitch TV. YouTube had limits of 10 minutes per video. And there were plenty of other options for video hosting as well. But even then, like, Let's Plays were not videos all the time. They sometimes were, or most of them in the early days were screenshots with text commentary. And I think part of the desire to do these things, to make Let's Plays and to share them in a wider space on the internet, comes from sort of a sense of nostalgia almost. I've interviewed a lot of Let's Players from the early days, and a lot of them said that they got a similar feeling to when, like, they were kids going over to a friend's house and watching them play a game, or playing a game and having their friend talk to them as they were playing. And it was this desire for a shared gaming experience that motivated a lot of them to make Let's Plays. And I think that still holds true. I think there's still something to be said for watching someone else play a game and sort of sharing in that feeling of being beside them. It's why a lot of streamers and Let's Players are very conversational in their commentary, and how they like to address their audience and talk to them and respond to whatever questions or comments they might have. And I think that's gotten just more and more pronounced as time has gone on, as Let's Playing and streaming has gotten their legs.
Such a good point, that warmth and kind of connection that we can form, like when just watching someone play a game. It's a really special feeling, I think.
And it's doubly interesting because it takes an interactive media form and makes it non-interactive, in the sense that you are becoming more of a spectator than you are a participant in a lot of cases. Although there are exceptions to that. There have been Let's Plays where the audience is an integral player in whatever is going on. But those are somewhat rare in terms of, especially nowadays.
And I suppose there's kind of there's a real spectrum of everything from kind of playing a game or a version of the game and broadcasting that to, I mean, one branch of the cosplay tree is kind of almost a sense of enacting. I mean, it's not specific to games, but these kind of media experiences and stepping into the shoes. And at least my understanding of something like kind of cosplay, like, Let's Plays, like streaming, is that it's very much a form of play in which it's audience directed. It's kind of oriented outwards, as opposed to, I guess, the traditional idea that a lot of people have about, games kind of suck you into the screen and you're focused on the rectangle, and that's kind of your perspective. Maddie, is that sort of right? As the cosplayers that you talk to what extent do you sort of see echoes in this idea of kind of spectacle creation and kind of the performativity of kind of game experiences or other experiences?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's great to see how much plays thriving among adults, I guess, in terms of being just in terms of, I guess, being a passive, having passive interactions with people playing games in terms of watching them, or the more active ones that Brian was discussing too. When it comes to actually, I guess, deciding to make the kind of perhaps, it's a very open decision. You're putting yourself on the line and saying, I'm going to physically put my love for a game or a property or a pop culture item on myself, and actually basically use that as a mechanism for meeting other people. And in cosplay, it's like you're saying, it's very much opposite to that traditional idea of that necessarily like totally insular nerdy character. A lot of us still are, but ultimately when it comes to being able to costume yourself and actually go out and interact with people, it's very much I guess this huge relief to be able to simultaneously adopt a character that you love and at the same time bridge a connection with other people that you perhaps in some cases, and it's not all cases, but in some cases, it might have been difficult for you growing up due to, you know, feeling like a bit of an outsider in a lot of cases for some of us in the community. And having literally a signifier of what you like on your body can be a much less intimidating way of meeting new people, because in cosplay, you never walk up and have to do boring small talk. You can go up and say, I loved that game so much. I want to tell you all about how much I love this character. And that is, to me, such a positive way of seeing adults play. And, you know, in the sense of the kind of performative nature of it too, there is so many intricate, like, and just hearing Jane and Lucy talk, it's just funny to me how much, I guess, because of the nature of gaming being a digital process and then having to physically wear it, there's this incredibly complicated situation where you've got people actually, I guess, replicating or relating their behaviors physically to things that they've learnt or experienced only ever online. And that in itself is already this kind of awkward thing for a human. But I guess performing it with others, and we're talking people from, you know, children all the way through to my oldest participants who are in their 70s. This is not something that is ultimately restricted to anyone. Everyone in the community kind of parrots this notion of cosplay is ultimately an activity for everyone that likes a game. And I guess that kind of element of it, yeah, it does bring this incredibly social space for gamers to interact and even just observe other people showing their creative talents in terms of the incredible time and money and effort that goes into costuming. It can be such a heartwarming experience to see someone else reflect that love that you have and may not have shared before in such an artistic and creative way. And of course, just leading on from what Brian said too, this does, and in a lot of cases does, result in cases where people are particularly talented or perhaps have a particular level of dedication. There are professional pathways that are emerging for people in cosplay too, which is usually a surprise for a lot of people, but it does tie into areas like streaming, but also areas like creating video content, how-to videos, tutorials, doing modeling, engaging in, you know, personal, I guess, crowdfunding practices. There's so many elements where this can also become a professional practice for people that actually does create, like, give them a career pathway. And in those cases, the level of kind of costuming and performance obviously amplifies to a degree of professionalism, where people can actually get directly sponsored by a game company. In the case of CD Projekt Red's game Cyberpunk, they distributed basically designs of the actual characters to cosplayers prior to the game's release even. And these kind of relationships are building where I guess cosplayers are being invited to, help game creators also display what they're creating. And it's created again, just this really kind of absurdly physical way of experiencing, love and passion for games, which is ultimately, again, maybe seen as such a, insular and digitally focused practice.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go, Jane. Yeah.
I was just going to jump in there just to say again, bring it back to children, because that's what I researched. Yeah. That Please. Kind of the idea of games being very insular and very, it's screen time, it's the screen. However, we know that, like, I haven't done this research myself, but there's a whole bunch of research looking at children's playground play and just the influence of pop culture, including video games, on kind of the narrative structures and what happens on school playgrounds. So that it's not really, and it's not necessarily a case of copying and regurgitating content, but they'll remix it, they'll bring in different elements of different fantastical storylines, they'll improvise. I know of examples of children playing Minecraft at school where they'll use gum nuts and bits and pieces from around the school, in service of their overarching narrative. And then that can cause problems. For example, there's a study that found that children were playing Call of Duty on the primary school playground, and they had to kind of devise the strategy where if a teacher would walk past, they would have to pretend to be playing something else because you're not allowed to play Call of Duty at school. So I just want to say that, and the social capital, like this, the social connection that can form through having a common interest in games is there from childhood. So children will have these conversations and share gaming knowledge on the school playground. and then come home and do experience it online. And just on that point, I just want to mention that, we have to remember that there are people who don't have access to these online play experiences. So we know, for example, so I can't remember the exact percentage of households in Australia that have access to the internet, but I know with children, there is a risk that some may be left out because they don't have access to those kind of shared cultural sets of knowledge. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just something to consider in terms of equity and access to all of these sorts of things that we're talking about. It's not, I just want to say it's not, we shouldn't take it for granted that everyone can access these sorts of spaces.
Just on that point, Jean, yeah, I think that's just something I wanted to make sure I emphasize as well, is that ultimately, regardless of, I guess, how these things kind of result. So in the case of, let's say a cosplayer creating a costume and then streaming it live or taking a photo of it, or a kid doing a seemingly playing a game that replicates something they've seen on cinema. These seemingly kind of like small actions, or people might see them as just little kind of engagements and hobbyist sort of things. In terms of cosplay with this career pathway, the level of, I guess, effort that goes into not only creating a costume, but at the moment, it's absolutely crucial to have a digital persona that reflects your physical persona as well. It's ultimately hard work. And I just wanted to mention that, yeah, even if you even see with kids how they spend time collecting rocks and sticks to create their imaginary world, this is just in terms of professional cosplay or even hobbyist cosplay, we've got the same actions happening, same attention to detail, the same effort that goes into, I guess, building these spaces for escape. But when it comes to actually becoming something in terms of in a professional sense, I just wanted to mention that, yeah, the inherent labor in that, whether you're becoming a streamer, whether you're becoming a professional cosplayer, it is essentially no different from perhaps your traditional career pathway, where you still got to build a personal brand, an audience, a portfolio, right, Brian? And at the same time, you have to worry about this or have concerns about this notion that as people, we're not living just as Maddie talking to you guys now. I'm also living as Maddie on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all these different things. And it is very much about managing yourself as a digital and physical thing all the time. It's not an easy gig. So yeah, again, I just want to stress that it's, though there are some opinions that perhaps engaging in something like cosplay or streaming or gaming, it's a waste of time. It's not, it's not going to result in anything. We're seeing the exact opposite effects of that in 2020 and beyond, because of course with COVID, there was sort of this big extra push for anything developing in digital spaces to start to see further articulation. And in all of our spaces, I know we're seeing different ways for people to actually follow the thing they love as a career. But in saying that, it is also possible to massively fail, and in many cases be streaming to no one, be cosplaying to a tiny audience, and be, making props for no one, doing these things to no audience. And so
but for yourself.
Right, exactly.
And if these people are enjoying what they're doing, then there's no reason for them to stop doing it.
Absolutely.
But I've seen Let's Players who've gone from a handful of viewers to having massive audiences and patronages on their Patreons. But even then, some of them aren't interested in making it big. Some of them are just doing it to enjoy doing it.
100%. Absolutely. And the people that are, I guess, wanting to push it further, they do have to accept this extra labor as a part of it.
Especially if they weren't already doing it.
Yeah, which they mostly are, right? Even
yeah, they're most usually the transition from amateur to professional and making money off of it does not require very much more investment in number of hours or time.
Another interesting point.
This might be our last topic, but I think we've got time, and I think it's worth kind of getting into this question one step further, which is it's kind of this idea of, we've started off, we're talking about play as this intrinsically motivated thing, but then there's an idea that various forms of play and creation are labor, and that kind of term, and also it's content creation, a very kind of familiar term these days. In some sense, it's on behalf of yourself, but it can be on behalf of kind of the companies that are promoting a game, or that are kind of hoping to use the work that players do, even the assets that they create, as kind of part of their business strategy, their business model, which means that perhaps unexpectedly kind of labor relations can be an important topic in games research. Geoffrey, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of the issues in kind of this area of co-creation, and how that's come along in recent years?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of this area of study that I'm looking at in private servers is very adjacent to another component, which is this idea of co-creation. And typically, just to define that, co-creation is the activity of building things with other people's IP to contribute. So you're co-creating with the intellectual property owner. You're making things, in the case of games, you're making things for other games. You're making levels, you're making mods. In the past, this is, and it continues to be, we really view this as a symbiotic relationship, right? You touched on that a moment ago. People are creating things for things that they love. They're making mods for games that they love. They're participating in the culture that helps promote it. And that's where that symbiotic relationship comes in. The intellectual property owner gains a benefit from that. A game that has more mods is more valuable than a game that doesn't, because there's more things for people to do. So there's a real, there's a benefit to both sides. The participant of co-creation, they're making things for things that they like. However, we've started to see, certainly recently, some more kind of suspect or issues surrounding these co-creation kind of start to creep in. So my go-to example, of course, is Dota, right? So Defense of the Ancients, a mod made for the Warcraft 3 game, and which became really massively popular as a custom map in the Warcraft 3 community. And the creators of that mod were astute enough to observe that, hey, they're really onto something interesting here. And they spun out a company, and the part of the team was acquired by or acqui-hired by another company. And we wound up with Dota and League of Legends, multi-billion-dollar companies, right? Now, that was a relationship which resulted in a whole genre of games emerging. But we're starting to see that change a little bit. Now, as we're seeing sort of new players in the industry and new structures appear. So, for example, Warcraft 3 Remastered, the new version of Warcraft 3, includes the same kind of tools that the original developers or the original mod makers would use to make custom mods. But now the end user license agreement, it explicitly transfers intellectual property ownership of the game design of custom levels made with these tools to Activision Blizzard. So if you make a wildly successful mod for Warcraft 3 Remastered, you don't have any kind of ability to take that on and to make something. Activision Blizzard now owns it. You've signed away your license there. So there's a kind of disruption there of this symbiotic relationship when money's kind of starting to get involved. This starts to really think about, okay, well, the labor involved with our game mod creation, has value, and how people can see that value is a really difficult question right now, and what they can do with it. We can see this worryingly in things like Roblox, and even maybe in the company that's making, the company Hit Record, which is contributing towards the development of Beyond Good and Evil 2. These companies are building the concept of user-generated concept or content into the core of their product. They're now, I'm not going to use this word lightly, but they're exploiting the labor of others to build the financial benefit of their own companies. They're financially tied to this labor that the participants are engaging in. So at that point, we really need to start asking some serious questions about games, creation, co-creation, labor, and especially ones that are targeting children, like Roblox is, for example.
Anyway, we could talk literally all day, but we'd better wrap it up there. Thank you at home for watching. Thank you very much. I'll just say on behalf of everyone, for Jane, Lucy, Madeline, Geoffrey, and Brian, and myself, thanks so much for watching and enjoy the rest of PAX. Cheers.
Thanks.